So, today I'm so lucky to be speaking to you, Stephanie Hare, political risk analyst and historian and also author. Please tell me a little about your latest project.
So last year I published a book called Technology is Not Neutral. It's a short guide to technology ethics. And what that is all about really is helping anyone, you don't have to be a tech person to read it, to better understand the role that we want technology to play in our lives and how we might go about thinking through that question. So it's for everybody, it's a democratic book.
But it has met some resistance, companies arguing that it will stiffen innovation. What's your thought on that?
I mean, I think when you've been old enough for long enough, you realize that companies are just going to always protest and push back against any government regulation, right? And government always wants to put their oar in and get involved, even when people don't want them to. So if people are complaining, it's probably a sign that something's going well, weirdly. And this isn't the first major piece of legislation. You know, we had the General Data Protection Regulation back in 2018, the GDPR. That really set the global tone and showed that the EU was capable of shaping global legislation. So even if a US company is based in Silicon Valley, it has to pay attention to what's happening in Europe. And then this year we had the Digital Services Act come online, Digital Markets Act has come online, and now we're getting ready to see if the European Parliament will pass, we assume it will, the AI Act in December. And then companies will have 2 years to put that into effect. So really Europe is the heart of tech regulation.
But what are your thoughts on, how do you find the right balance between innovation and regulating AI, for instance?
I actually think that regulation plays a very important part in innovating, because what the market needs, if you want to take it from a purely capitalist perspective, the market needs to know what's in play and what is out of play and where the lines are, because once it knows that, it can function within that domain. When things are left really unclear, like the use of facial recognition technology, can the police use it? Can private companies or museums or shops use it? Can a private citizen use it on their front door, right, to check parcels, but also they're spying on all of the neighbors? That's where things get very gray. So having legislation in place actually brings clarity, and then you can hopefully get to better market functioning. So I think it actually helps innovation.
That's really interesting. Then I can reframe and ask, what do you think the focus should be when regulating new technologies and AI?
So I would think the first step is transparency. So we have to understand how technologies are used. We need to be able to explain them to people so they can understand, how is this impacting my life? And then the key thing really is accountability. So it's not very useful if you have the transparency and you know how it's working, but you can't ever hold anyone to account, right? So you need that third pillar, and that's about your regulators actually taking action. And that's something that I would say the EU might need to evolve in its thinking, because right now regulators just issue fines, right? So if a big American company is found doing something naughty with data, what happens is the EU regulator will say, you need to pay, $1 billion or whatever. Those companies are making so much money that they would be happy to pay that fine. What they need to see is they actually need the regulator to say, you can't do that anymore, and you need to delete that data that you wrongfully took. That starts to affect their business model. That's what I need to see happening in the future, because otherwise we're just get into a case where these companies will just dedicate a portion of their revenues every year to writing off fines and carry on doing things they shouldn't.
So they need new kind of methods to regulate AI.
Yeah.
And what do you see as a potential risk if AI does not get adequately regulated?
I'm not so worried about the Terminator scenario, potentially at my peril. I'll be the first one that it comes for. I'm more worried about unintended consequences. I think there can sometimes be, in the rush to be fast, to do things fast, we don't always think through what might be the second, third, fourth order consequences, down the line of an effect that can take time. And we don't often think about how different forces are interacting with each other. So you don't just introduce a technology into society and then it has a linear effect. What ends up happening is it kind of explodes, right? And it ripples out, I guess, throughout. But in 3D, it's rippling out. In 3D, it's rippling out across time. And that's the thing that kind of worries me is, are the people who are building it and passing laws and regulating, are they thinking in that way? That's quite a sophisticated new way that humans aren't very good at the moment, myself included.
Yeah, and how can we even do so? I mean, it is kind of predicting the future in a way.
Weirdly, I actually think by having the kind of conversations that we're having, because once you start to have the conversations, and there are more and more of them happening all the time, to the credit of the people working in artificial intelligence in particular, it's very open at the moment. A lot of the research papers have been published online. You can easily read them. You can now more than ever look at the conferences and interviews and conversations with top researchers in the field and see what's happening. So the more we're all having that, the more we can be aware. It doesn't even have to be in your country. It might be in another country, but you can look to it and point to it and go, hey, wait a minute, this is happening there. We need to be careful about here. So I think it's becoming mindful and intentional, and going, what do we want to use this technology for? What problem does it solve? Right? And once you do that, then you start going, I want it for this, but not that. It can be used by these people, but not these people, or in these circumstances, but not those. And you start to think it through.
So the transparency, the openness, and the dialogue is actually key.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like the scientific method that normally you would expect researchers to be doing. It's kind of happening on a global scale now with all of us, right? Because we're all involved, I think, with technology, climate change, the pandemic. There's even inequality. There's a whole number of problems that are happening across the globe, and everyone is very connected now and can see that and can be aware of that, and more people are speaking other languages, or there's even translation tools that you can use, so if you don't speak it, you can still access it. So you can see, and with that knowledge comes the power to then ask better questions and imagine what you want for your own life or your own country. That's pretty exciting. And even like for children, technology is not just something for grown-ups, obviously. It really affects kids. Getting kids involved in these discussions as well. We didn't see that before. I mean, that feels like a very new thing, and something that we could really, I think, expand upon.
Association of Nordic Engineers, we discuss a lot, like the ethical responsibilities of engineers, STEAM professionals, but also how should policymakers, what can they do to support them? What are your thoughts on this subject?
I would love for us to hear from engineers more, because I think policymakers want to support, but most policymakers don't have an engineering background or a STEM background, a STEAM background even. So they're not close enough to understand the problems, the opportunities, the things that are blocking them from achieving their vision in the way that perhaps they might with other fields like law, which is the classic one, or politics that they might study. So we need engineers to be taking their work out into society, or inviting people in to come in and be part of the design process. And also, engineering is ultimately a design and problem-solving process. So it's going to be more inclusive if they're designing with society. Having the ethical point that you just raised means getting all the different perspectives of different stakeholders or users into that from the very beginning.
Let's hope that the politicians will also invite in the engineers.
Yeah,
that's a good point. In ANA, we represent different trade unions in the Nordic region, representing engineers and STEM professionals. When we talk about AI, cross-border technologies, how do you see the role of trade unions in the future, addressing these ethical dilemmas that engineers will face and promote responsible tech, really?
So I think there's a few ways that you can answer that question. The first would be just trade unions in general, regardless of where they're based, Nordic or not, would want to be, and I'm sure are, really upgrading their knowledge and perspective on the different types of technologies that are evolving so fast and how that is relevant for workers. The second point, I would say, speaks to the point you just made about it being a cross-border technology, in the case of artificial intelligence, for instance. Different trade unions work differently in different countries. So what we can actually see is a very experimental approach where different unions could be watching and learning from each other to see whose approach works the best. And I'm thinking of things like automation of jobs and what that's going to do to workers, I'm thinking of worker surveillance, which really changes the power dynamic even more between bosses and workers. Not ideal, perhaps. And then maybe the third thing would be not necessarily viewing technology and AI in particular as something that's antagonistic, technology versus workers, but going, what do we need to do to upskill and empower workers so that they can work with this technology and add value for themselves and their jobs in new ways?
Well, thank you. It was amazing. And thank you for taking the time to come to Copenhagen.
Thank you for inviting me.